Hello, Foresight Games community. It's so great to join you. I'm David. I am the founder and CEO of Valens Games. And with me is Eleanor Ross, no relations, who is a game designer in our company. And my background is that of a practitioner and subject matter expert working on violent non-state actors issues. I've gotten to do a lot of interesting things in that regard, from writing department level strategies on counterterrorism to work on hostage negotiations to spending time in war zones and other dangerous places. And just ultimately found a way of doing games that I thought was useful for part of what my job was, and that is education, training, foresight and risk analysis, decision making, analysis, basically allowing us to see things we wouldn't see otherwise. Now, normally I don't love videos in a presentation, but I'm going to start with a video. It's not going to be very long, and you're not going to be able to understand what the hell is going on in this particular video in terms of the game, but it will give you a kinetic feel of one of our games, which is a hybrid of live and digital experience. I thought this would be helpful to set the stage. So here we go.
Google has done innovation. It has launched a social media platform that it calls Chirps. We defied security forces using violence with impunity to force the Egyptian dissidents into submission. I have received reports that students heard the vast government who conducted the raid speaking Russian. A prominent European commentator on the right of the political spectrum says, let's put our own citizens first. A prominent political commentator on the French left says that the EU must ensure our migration policies reflect our commitment to fairness and compassion after what Europe has done to keep the developing world down. Any questions about the game?
All right, I love that video. As I said, you cannot tell what's going on in that video, but what it gives you is a sense of kind of the kinetic feel of one of our games. That is, there were a lot of, this was a game we ran at Georgetown. It's a game, it's a game that we're currently running as a multi-week immersive exercise at Duke University called Acceleration. And at Georgetown, there were 5 different teams who were split up into different rooms. You can see them working through on the chalkboard, trying to figure out what's going on. So that helps to anchor my argument. And I want to state what my argument is. It's about a certain kind of gameplay that we do, which we refer to as immersive exercises. And the basic argument that I want to make is this. Our games feature things like characters we've developed. They have usually strong story arcs and plot lines. They have deeply built worlds, and they have social media artifacts and news artifacts that are really entertaining, and you're going to get to see some of that. And the argument I want to make is that if you look at the world of war games, sometimes these things are thought of as not serious, or sometimes they're thought of as distractions from the game. I want to make this argument that, number one, they are not distractions. They actually help to build a better game, and they help to replicate the way that we humans think, number one. Number two, that there's a little bit of a virtuous cycle that goes on, that when a game is fun, people are able to immerse more. When they're able to immerse more and also link that to something fun or interesting they see, that actually helps to anchor their experience. In other words, the learning outcomes are magnified. And then the final thing is that this is best able to actually produce the learning outcomes and the analytic outcomes that we as wargamers want. That, in other words, when you create a system of effortless learning, where rather than immersing in a game being a slog or something that seems like not a great use of their time, or at least not how they'd want to spend it, but instead becomes sort of, addictive. Something where it's as fun to them as like watching TikTok videos or playing a game of chess. Not that those two things are comparable, but when it becomes something that's addictive, you produce effortless learning, which is just much better from all of our perspective in terms of making people want to play games, making them immerse well, making them learn things about the universe, and ultimately producing learning outcomes. That's my fundamental argument for the immersive exercise style of game. And so you can give it this single sentence summary that fun should be part of the experience. Fun should be a feature and not a bug for the kinds of games that we all work on. So in this presentation, Eleanor and I are going to talk about what is an immersive exercise, world building, believability, Sorry,
Microphone, yeah.
I think that we should probably make sure there's muting all along. Believability, and open-ended explorations and interactions with adjudicators. Those are the areas we're going to cover in terms of our own practices, and we're really looking forward to this conversation with all of you. So in terms of what an immersive exercise is, there's a few components that to us typify our style of gameplay. And I will say that I think that there are others who do things that are very much like immersive exercises. We just think that it's a sufficiently different genre than your standard game that it merits no problem at all. I appreciate the sorry there. It's a sufficiently different genre that it merits its own name. And so what typifies for us an immersive exercise is that, as all of us look to do, it provides insight into the real world in some way. There's a whole host of ways games can provide some insight into the real world. I don't need to tell you all about that. You're experts in this. Secondly, immersive exercises will always have intense and carefully crafted media environments. And we will show you examples of this, but it includes news, social media, video, team memos, and the like. It includes careful attention to world building. The world is lovingly created and inhabited by history and characters. It lives and breathes. Fourth aspect of immersive exercises is they will typically, though not always, have compelling narrative arcs. Humans are storytelling creatures, and immersive exercises should tell a compelling story. The one exception is that we sometimes produce what we call crafted games, but also there are competitive games where the competition itself is the story. For example, a geopolitical competition. For something like that, you can't really have a pre-baked narrative. You can have a few pre-baked ideas, but you can't pre-bake a narrative when it's entirely open-ended. The final thing, as I've alluded to, is entertainment value. The game should be fun. Immersive exercises should always be fun and evaluated in part on whether they're enjoyable to play regardless of the gravity of what they're looking at. So, Eleanor, I want to kick to you. You have something to say, and I want you to tell them what an information environment is.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, David. So I just wanted to go over how our immersive exercises can be fun, even if the situation is incredibly serious. And I think the adding of the fun aspect, as David was alluding to and said explicitly, is what makes those heightened situations more credible and makes people actually remember kind of the takeaways. Like I said at the beginning, I am currently working on a game, or we call an immersive experience, an MX, having to do with North Korea as one of the actors and nuclear weapons. These are heavy topics, but at the same time, we have eccentric personalities and people that we'll get to in a little bit that kind of level the playing field out and make it feel real. And so when you make a situation feel real and at the same time have this full world, this narrative arc, while having a little bit of a fear factor in the background, nuclear weapons are a heavy topic. That's kind of what builds out a successful information environment, in my opinion. So if you could go on to the next slide, I can go into our idea of what information environment is. So it's how we deliver the world to participants. You all know exactly that something needs to be built, obviously, for an MX or a game to work. And so ours, we do a specific way. We give read-ahead materials that teams sometimes read, often they don't. It gives more context for people if they want to or they don't. We have a news feed and we have team-specific injects and role players. And David, how have you enjoyed being a role player in the past?
I love being a role player. Often, role playing can add, not just angles to the game, but oftentimes characters that are created spur of the moment end up becoming part of the canon. I'll get to that a little bit more when we talk about characters, but I think role playing is essential. And if you look at what Eleanor was talking about in terms of the ways that you can interact with an information environment, all of these together create a world that lives and breathes. The role players are the way that people actually are able to talk to the world and delve in with more information that goes beyond like the memos and things like that. And it replicates the way, having been in the policy world and done operational work, it replicates the way that we interact with any sort of problem set, right? You talk to people who are knowledgeable, who are specific experts. You read non-public materials, you read public materials. So to turn from there to a news feed, you're going to get to see an example of the news feed, but it's meant to be basically a replication of your day-to-day intake of information. It includes how you intentionally take in news, such as newspapers or news channels or X, and then how you passively get the news. You often get, just from osmosis, a large amount of opinions about the world. And the news feed, we curate it, but curate it in such a way that, part of it is entertaining junk. Part of it is really useful. Part of it is useful but slightly inaccurate. And what this is designed to do is to help train people to be careful connoisseurs of media. Now, again, in order for it to be done right, it can't rest on the surface. I've played too many games where it's obvious just from one news article that it's not reported quite right and what's actually going on, because the creators felt the need to bake in enough clues that a reasonably informed person could understand exactly what's going on. To me, there's much more reward in actually trying to replicate the way inaccuracies would occur without trying to provide clues. That's something I do, which is annoying to some people, but I think is actually the way it should be done, which is often there'll be puzzles within the game, and I haven't created a way to solve the puzzle, right? Teams might solve the puzzle, they might not. But in the real world, like, no one's curating the world and making sure every puzzle can be solved. I think it's good to have clues that don't necessarily lead you to a final understanding. We believe in use of AI. Large language models have really revolutionized the way we do this kind of work. One thing I will mention with respect to AI and large language models, I'm not here to sell tech, but we do have a design platform which we're rolling out the next iteration of on November 15, which is designed to really speed up the process of producing games like those that we're describing. There's a variety of things that it does very well. If any of you are interested among the designers here, feel free to reach out. You'll have my email address. We'd be happy to demo what we're working on. But I'm really proud of the Providence platform and think it will make a huge difference in the field that we are all working in. So with that, we turn to our ideas about world building. And this is where the presentation gets a little bit more fun, because we're going to present things that represent a game that we're actually running right now. I mentioned the game Acceleration. That's the video that you saw before. And as I mentioned, we're running it at Duke University. So at Duke, what we're doing is actually pretty cool. I want to give a little bit of background. We applied with our partners at Duke. I've been running a course at Duke University for about 4 years now. And the course is an immersive exercise or a game run at the Sanford School, the public policy school. It is for credit, and students, immerse and play for about 7 weeks. There's, a little bit of time on the front end and the back end of that, during which there's a kind of a wrap-up session, an introduction to gaming and the like. But basically, students just play a game for multiple weeks. And what it's designed to do is have them immerse in a topic. The topic that we have now is white nationalism, polarization, mass migration, climate change, a number of different bound up issues together, which form a fairly coherent game called Acceleration. And it's designed to make people think about the topics through their engagement. It's designed to help them use something which I've found important as a professional, which is spot research, to help them do things they don't normally learn in class, like to negotiate, to read a room, and the like. And in fact, I'll mention the grant, and then I'm going to kick to Eleanor because we have a story of how we met. We received a grant last year from a center of excellence. It's called Ncite, Ncite, at the University of Nebraska. It's a DHS center of excellence, and we won a grant to work with our partners at Duke to study the learning outcomes of our immersive exercises. The results aren't final yet, but my co-principal investigator, David Schenzer, and I had a piece come out just yesterday, which shows the early outcomes that we've gotten through course surveys, which are done by methodologists at Duke University. This should be exciting for all of us because it shows that there are positive learning outcomes. And those of you who are familiar with the academic literature on games and education will know that most of the literature concludes that games are positive in an educational environment. However, if you look at the methodologies, they're a little bit, they're not questionable, but they can be questioned in that they're mainly based upon self-reporting. I think that our study is the first one to provide objective metrics on the learning outcomes, which is exciting and should hopefully be helpful to everyone in this room, because once the educational value of games is firmly established, that opens up a lot of opportunities for all of us, and that's a great thing. So Eleanor and I actually first met because she was my star student in the class I was running at Duke last semester. And I'd love, Eleanor, for you to take over here and tell what it was like being a student in the class where you are now the person designing the game for other students. And let's let you talk a little bit about world building, because you've done such a great job building the world of acceleration.
Thanks, David. Yeah, so that's how David and I actually met first. He showed the world of acceleration in our first class, and I thought, this sounds amazing. I would love to be a part of this. Full honesty here, before joining the class, I had never played a video game in my life. I had never done an immersive exercise in my life. I wasn't and am still really not a techie person. I was an Arabic major at Duke. I studied Middle Eastern policy. And I was the team lead for Germany, which was a country for in the game in one of the 5 groups for acceleration. And it was first and foremost fun. That is what really drew me in and made me learn. We were a little bit under the underdog team, I would say. We were the only full undergraduate team. The other teams had master students, and it was a different experience having people with background and knowledge on it. But a lot of what David said was there was spot research, there was a compelling plot, as it says on the slide, that really made us engage critically and think about new ideas and different ways. I think one of the things that immersive exercises do is they make people who maybe not, that they show people who have different backgrounds and they bring them together, and you get to use your strengths. So we had, a psych major and a biologist in our group, and that was actually really helpful in the long term because they brought different perspectives, and I wouldn't have been able to work with these people without like this environment or, the idea of a war game, which on the surface is just fun, which brings people to join. So when we're actually creating the game, which I'm doing now because I'm on the back end, I'm actually running the Duke game this year. And with the help of David, we've made some edits and adjustments that I think are very fun and exciting. But we established narrative and we're trying to figure out what we're trying to say with the game. And then you create this narrative around it. What I like to do and what David and I have done is we add extra, tangents. One of the things that I think people don't realize, or at least the game that exists before, is sometimes things exist that don't necessarily have an outcome. They are there and they can be pulled on. They're threads that can be pulled on, but they're not inherently something that will have a big reveal at the end or a situation. And that's just like the real world. I really, really want to emphasize what David said in how games and MXs need to mirror the real world. And the way we can do that is by not having everything planned out. So of course there's the primary structure, there's a direct plot that's going to happen. But then there's the secondary, there's a history, there's non-player characters, there's phenomenons. We had a Diddy quote in our recent game that we threw in that was really fun. We had, what are some other things we had, David, that are some pop culture references?
Well, we'll get to show all of it, but I think that my favorite pop culture reference that we have is a controversial character named Ellsworth Wickman, one of my favorite characters that we've created. And he has this oeuvre of various cultural phenomena, including Gulag the Musical, which is a romantic comedy set in a gulag, which, and it's not extraneous. All of this is meant to show something about the world, because a world is going to be reflected in its pop culture. Thus, like any really good science fiction book that you read, one of the things that you should pay attention to is like, what is the pop culture? Because the pop culture is telling you something about what the world is like. If you think of Hunger Games, like that is actually a novel about pop culture, right? The Hunger Games have become entertainment in that particular world. And so it's entirely about pop culture. Running Man is just the same. So we always pay attention to what would the pop culture look like in the world that we're trying to look at. Acceleration is a world about identity fault lines within and between civilizations, and it's about polarization. And so the media that is popular in this world is inherently extraordinarily polarizing in interesting ways. So in looking at world building, we're going to give you some examples from Acceleration, which is a 5-team game, the way that we're running it. By the way, for any game that we run, we typically will have about 8 or 9 teams that we can sub in, because it's always interesting to look at how the game changes when you switch up the actors. Here's the ones that we're running for this iteration of Acceleration. It was the same also the past few times that we've run it, other than when we collapse it down to only 4 teams. But White House, Google, Russian Federation, Germany, and California are the 5 actors. And just to walk you through, this is not going to be time consuming, but we'll walk you through different facets of the world, and you can see how they're represented. It ranges from the Stockhausen group, which is a sort of successor to the Wagner group that is a quasi-proxy of the Russian government, but also Russia fears that their Frankenstein's monster could escape from their control, as happened before. This is a game about identity fault lines, as I mentioned, and polarization and separatism. And even though Russia in the West is able to influence and drive some of this, they also have their own concerns about separatism. Those of you who are familiar with Kaliningrad, it's pictured there, real place. It's on the map between Poland and Lithuania, Russian territory that is in Europe and separated from Russia. And within this game, there is a separatist movement there called the Free Königsberg Front. Königsberg being a German way to refer to Kaliningrad, which Russia even has to worry about separatism within this game set in 2028. We provide notes on what the political figures are in California. By the way, there's mentions of media packet. That's just something that we have, which encompasses articles that are a little bit too large for our newsfeed. In the newsfeed, almost everything should be able to fit onto a slide. So once in a while, for longer items, we'll just have them in the media packet. Though, by the way, I think we're getting a little bit away from media packets because we realize that it's perhaps a little bit more convenient to people to have multi-slide articles rather than having a separate packet they have to look at. I mentioned Gulag the musical earlier on, romantic comedy set in a gulag, and the 2 love interests are a gulag administrator and a gulag guard, just to further emphasize the controversial nature of that particular cultural artifact. There's a controversial district attorney in San Francisco with various people weighing in. You'll see that one of them is AOC. We'll have a mix of real commentators and fictional commentators. Marsha Witherspoon, Corey Morris, both of them are fictional commentators. And I'll say a word about real commentators in a second, because that's something which there's a methodology to. Here again, 2 real commentators, Colin Clark, terrorism expert at the Soufan Center, and Jonathan Greenblatt, the executive director of the Anti-Defamation League, both weighing in on a white nationalist settlement that has emerged in Northern California in the game. Well, a little bit more to say about the ethnography of Grenada, California, in that it plays a relatively big world. Now, one of the things that I really enjoyed in this particular iteration of Acceleration is one of the things that happens during the game that California has to grapple with and provides a real opening for some of the white nationalist characters is a huge outbreak of wildfires in California. And there was a lot of world building that went into that. And Eleanor, you did a great job on this. I want to kick this to you.
So one of the things that I built out for this turn and this game, as opposed to the game that I participated in, was this wildfire background. What we did is we had the California team slowly realize that climate change was an issue, so they could preemptively respond to it. And then whether or not they responded well or not, there's still going to be a wildfire that happens. So this was the first move that they made. They had some background information in the team packets that we mentioned earlier that says there's a big issue, wildfires are a problem. And so Governor Campo, who's the governor in the game, orders a major boost to wildfire prevention. If you could go to the next slide. But then, oh no, a county wildfire kills 2 residents. So it comes around and it devastates the community. But because of the work that has already been done by Team California, it's not as bad as it could be. As David said, this is a game about identity fault lines. So Christopher Walsh, who is the mayor of Granada, actually steps in and does a campaign to get families back off the feet. This man is a white nationalist. It is a moderate white nationalist who has done a lot of work on aid in North Carolina in the past. And so we're trying to show that there are different levels and layers of people. A lot of the things we do in our MXs is we have a parallel situation. So with Christopher Walsh, who's a moderate white nationalist, we also have a moderate Islamic group, which is the Muslim Brotherhood, which is in Egypt, which is part of the game, but not part of this kind of section. Then wildfire mitigation efforts. So this is actually a move that Russia did. So Russia has a mole pretty much within the California government, and they are using that mole to direct aid towards affluent communities to cause unrest within the US. And this is a decision that was 100% decided by the Russian team and that I didn't create. The only kind of background I did in creating this plot line and then, moving it accordingly was there's a problem with climate change, and then there's a wildfire. And then California, the US, and Russia are responding. So Corey Morris is one of the kind of influencers under Russia's kind of web of lies. And he writes this article saying wildfire teams only protecting the wealthy in Shasta County, which is true because they've made that move. And so some of these people are under Russia's umbrella, like Marshall Witherspoon, but some, like the tagline, "Come at me, bro," who is Justin Walker III, is someone who is a real person inside Shasta County who has not been provided the aid needed because he is in a more rural town. And then California responds to these allegations. And that's another move that they made because this is a game that goes over 7 weeks. These are, teams are given a little bit more time to think about what's going on. And then there's a response from Russia. And then there's a response from, a Californian who's excited that the governor is taking some action. So I would say, that's what this was. It's open-ended exploration, which I'm going to kick back to David to explain. But this wouldn't have happened without, we give the background of a plot and we allow people to follow it through, although we have kind of left and right end parameters and basic ideas.
So here, the importance of a narrative. I mentioned narratives before. Basically, this can be understood as humans are storytelling creatures. And if you think of how we process history or process events, it's always through stories. It's never just kind of a series of events happening, but rather we try to make sense of it. And so it makes sense for a story to be a part of the game. It helps people to invest more in outcomes. And to understand that the game is not the only bounds. Like things pre-existed the game, they'll continue after the game. And so, generally speaking, the logic of our games is each turn is about a month within acceleration. But then once we get to the close, and we're doing the close for the Duke game in about 2 weeks, we then zoom out and show what happens in future history over the course of the next 5 to 6 years, sometimes more than that. The way the moves made in the game cue things up and what happens to the various characters. And one of the things that I think is a great validation of the approach is students will actually get really wrapped up in certain characters and what became of them. They're real to them in the same way that fictional characters in good shows are real to them. Now, we learn through narrative, and here I'll make kind of a point that Eleanor put her finger on. She talked about moderate white nationalists. That may sound kind of weird or paradoxical to everybody. And the point is not, of course, to kind of create apologia for white nationalism. Instead, it's that there are a variety of different kinds of white nationalists, ranging from, neo-Nazis and skinheads to people like Jared Taylor of American Renaissance, who takes more of a kind of an intellectual approach and is sort of ecumenical, bringing in, for example, Jewish white nationalists to his white nationalist conventions, which the more anti-Semitic white nationalists don't like. So there's a wide variety of different lenses here. And one of the interesting things that's occurring in this game is, Walsh had tried to set up this white nationalist settlement that would actually be kind of moderate and ecumenical from white nationalist standards, but isn't able to control the more extreme members of his group who come to the town. And what that's doing is just providing different layers. And when you can explore them in a way, it to me makes a game much more real rather than having characters just be sort of generically bad. If you look at kind of the different layers that exist within in any movement, no matter how odious the movement, it helps you to understand how social dynamics would actually play out. And as we all know, as game designers, that's what's useful to us. So there's a number of different layers of a plot, but I think a good way to emphasize those layers is one should not over determine a plot. We often plot with a number of different branches. Those of you who use branched storytelling in your games will understand kind of the way that you shouldn't over determine it. Some of the plots that we use will often have major plots where the teams can't necessarily influence all the events. And then we'll have minor plots where there's much more of an open-ended set of moves, where coming into a game, we just don't know what's going to happen. These are just different ways that we tend to structure games. And there are reasons why it's structured in that particular way, with the major plots being a little bit more predetermined. I already mentioned the different layers of the white nationalist movement, but I'd say that is kind of very inherent to the game, right? There's this figure named Javad Azari. He's a fictional character writing for the American Conservative who's there. And basically he's going through and kind of exploring and reporting on what he sees and the different factions that are within the town. And I think for me, like I have a background studying different kinds of non-state actors, ranging from violent extremist groups and terrorist groups to narco groups. The white nationalist movement is something I've studied a lot. So in part, this represents kind of years of immersing and understanding the different dimensions of this movement and trying to have it be represented in all of its variegations in Grenada, California. Believability is important. As we've made our case for, characters are at the heart of a game, regardless of whether you tend to focus on, nation states or look at smaller units in terms of what's important in international relations and politics. Like ultimately, human history is a human story. It's about human beings. Fictional characters are important to that. We tend to embed them within a plot. And one thing that I mentioned is that there's an intersection of real people in our games and fictional characters. This is something that I'll talk about a little bit, but one thing this opens up is unreliable narrators, right? The game world is represented by kind of multiple voices and perspectives. People understand the game world through memos, through news articles, through tweets, and all of these are very perspective laden. This is something that we know in the real world, and it's important in a game world as well. The final thing about having real people in a game is you should never mock them. Like, regardless of how much you disagree with them, it just has to be true to or how odious they are. It has to be true to form to those people. So one of the things that I do is often when I put people into our news feed, they will often be people that I know. That way I can show them, hey, we put fictional tweets from you in one of our games. Is this something you'd say? And so, like, ranging from people on the left to the right of the political spectrum, like I once took one of our tweets from Matt Duss, who was Bernie Sanders's foreign policy advisor, and asked him about it. He's like, "Oh yeah, this is exactly what I would say." My favorite one was Klon Kitchen, who at the time was at American Enterprise Institute and is a commentator on big tech issues. I showed him one of the tweets we built for him, and his response was, "Hey, I like that. Could I tweet it?" I was like, yeah, of course you can tweet the fictional tweet that we created for you. And I believe that he did. So that to me was like a complete victory and an example of games influencing real life. Eleanor, believability example, Christopher Walsh. I'm going to kick this one to you.
Absolutely. So we talked about Christopher Walsh a little bit, how he becomes the mayor of Granada. And so he initially arrives in Grenada or Granada, however y'all are looking to say it. And he tries to like set up the community. So if you go on to the next slide, and he's given, a kind of warm welcome. He brings a lot of people there, and he is working to kind of bring and improve the livelihood of people in Granada, and the one as well as the people him. So he wins the election. Actually, there's a special election that's had, and people really don't know his background. That he is, part of the white nationalist movement. This is kind of in the backdrop. Like David said, things are not always apparent in real life. So things are not always apparent in these immersive exercises. And he's a multidimensional person. So yes, he's a white nationalist, but also he is someone who's very passionate about the effects of climate change. And so he and his group of people, partly for selfish reasons to improve the appearance of himself, the EA, which is an alliance, a white nationalist group, point blank. So to improve the opinion of that and improve Granada's place within the community, does a lot of help within the area. He donates, $100,000 of his own money, which we don't know where he got that from. That was another thread that hypothetically could have been pulled on. So Russia, in some versions of this game, Russia is kind of funding Walsh. And Russia just didn't find that thread, didn't pull on it. They don't pull on a thread, we don't put it in the MX. This is one of the individuals who's kind of responding to Walsh and his aid. And yeah, so we develop a character, there's a lot to him. I think there's like a 15-page single space. This is who Christopher Walsh is. This is how he was born. Highly generated a little bit through a little AI and our prompts that we give to it. So we develop this long background, and the audience, the people who are playing, don't really get all of this. I'm going to pass Ellsworth Wickman over to David because this is his favorite character, and he wants to show him off, I know.
And I would note in response, Eleanor, to your elliptical comment that it is, in fact, Grenada, California.
Yes.
So just for the record, like I actually pronounced it Granada for the longest time. I grew up in Southern Oregon, not far from where Grenada, California is. And actually, when I went back to my high school reunion this past summer, I met some old high school classmates who live by Grenada. They were so happy that we'd set the game in Grenada. I did not tell them that it became a white nationalist settlement in our game because they might feel like less positive towards it then. But at any rate, they did verify how it's pronounced. Ellsworth Wickman, I mentioned him before, the controversial filmmaker and creative genius, the talent behind Gulag the Musical, also the talent behind a police procedural called Inquisition, which is a police procedural set in the Spanish Inquisition in which the Inquisitors are the protagonists. Essentially, he's obsessed with collectives and individuals, and in all of his creative oeuvre, the collective crushes the individual, and the collective is regarded as the hero. That's basically what his genre is. He came about in part. We were working on, and you can see here's a script from Gulag. It goes on for several pages, and you get to see the interactions between Mikhail, the prison guard, Lena, the administrator, and this poor prisoner who they're bullying as their romantic sparks are triggered. But at any rate, we were creating a game about polarization, and one aspect of polarization was the impact of what people refer to as cancel culture. And this was, I wrote this a number of years ago, and so it's projecting forward a little bit in, perceived constraints on speech, and people being uncomfortable, thinking that they might face some punishment for saying the wrong thing at certain times. And so the question was like, what kind of individual would enjoy and like benefit from this particular environment? The answer was Ellsworth Wickman. There's a number of layers to who he is, but he's a provocateur, and a provocateur in a way that's always kind of a safe way for him to push the envelope. The interesting thing is, and there's a number of different aspects as to how he relates to the public sphere, but to me, like, I get who Wickman is. To me, Wickman lives and breathes. He's a really interesting character, and what I found is that the audience they don't always get exactly what he's doing because he's not upfront with it. But they always gravitate toward him in some way, either usually with sort of a revulsion that's a train wreck effect, where they just can't look away. And in this particular game, you had one of the actors, Germany, actually commission a new creative work from Wickman, a pro-nuclear power uh, movie called Power Surge, which he was able to develop, but unfortunately, before he could fully develop it, he ended up getting arrested as a Russian agent. And while he was on his way to prison, he got into a car accident, but not before. Did he, as Eleanor mentioned, weighed in, tweeting from prison and weighing in on behalf of Ellsworth Wickman, saying, "I've looked into you and you seem pretty all right to me." Wickman was injured in a collision en route to the first court hearing. He ended up in a coma. Will he wake up? That has not yet been determined, but you can see people weighing in on that. At any rate, like to me, that is kind of how people interact with the game world, which to me, there's always so much benefit when people will look to take advantage of some of the characters or interact with them. It makes it real. Finally, interactions with adjudicators. And Eleanor, we have examples from you. So why don't you take this final section of our presentation?
Absolutely. I just wanted to add really quickly, and this is actually directly in reference to interactions with adjudicators. You learn from interacting with people what they're excited about, and you want to make sure you're creating material that people are excited about. So this is the secondary, tertiary, material that we put in. The turns and everything is based on the actions. So this is someone reaching out to me for a clarifying question about the nature of France's government. This is set in 2028, and I, respond either as the adjudicator, so as Eleanor, or often I respond as a role player. So I was Marie Dupont recently, which is a advisor to the president in the game, and I was speaking with Russia about whether they're potentially could do something, because we use actors. You're allowed to interact with actors who are not necessarily in the game. There's also, if you go to the next slide, David, people testing the bounds of gameplay. So someone asked, Team Germany asked us, do we have the ability to transit any information to ISIS? No, Germany cannot work outside of, the original bounds of that. And then there's, as you see in the second example, it's me responding as an adjudicator. So people need to submit a move in this certain way. And by providing the option for players to interact with me, it provides a lot more clarity on the game. So if they have any questions, they feel open. And B, it's just more fun. It's more fun for me on the, creator side of it. And it's more fun for the players, as I'm also aware of for when I was playing the MX.
So that's what we wanted to cover, but basically it comes down to the point that I made at the outset, which is that to us, world building, creating a fun environment, creating a number of characters isn't frivolous. This actually is a good way of making sure, in our opinion, that a game is as educational as possible, that it compels people to spend more time in the universe that you've created, and that learning outcomes result from that process of effortless learning. Both of our email addresses are up here. We often stay in touch with folks who see our presentations, but moreover, this is a community of game designers, and we really hope that we'll be able to interact with so many of you. That is the end of our presentation in chief, but I know that there's time to converse a little bit. So Randy, good time to draw you in right here.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much. That is so fascinating. Really great to get such a deep dive with so many rich examples. And I have a bunch of follow-up questions, but I'll open it up to the community first in case somebody wants to chime in with a pressing question that they have.
Sure. So, hi, I'm Michael. I actually ran a very similar class to your Accelerate back in 2017, which was about the invasion of a fictional post-Soviet republic on the Black Sea. Just sort of stuck another country in next to Georgia, which had an earthquake and an attack by little green men, and we had our class do disaster response and unconventional warfare, while trying to sort of figure out what to do with all these Spetsnaz troops showing up. Which was fun, a little bit of fiasco. It was beyond our ability, so I'm glad you're having better luck. So my question is on this. One of the things with a class is that you have a sort of a nice daily cadence to respond, right? You have 90 minutes, and then next class is on Thursday or whatever. How would you do things differently if you had to do this in 8 hours? Or what if you only had 3 hours to run this?
That is a great question. I'll give you a response because I've thought about this deeply, and we have a response that I love. But first, Michael, where did you teach the class?
It was at a little place called the Harrisburg University of Science and Technology.
Okay, in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania.
Yes.
Okay, awesome. So we actually we do this for our games. So we have a 7-week class at Duke. The same game, Acceleration, has been run in as few as 2.5 hours, and sometimes we'll do 3 or 4 hour versions of it. So remember, I have a team, right? It's not just me, and we'll staff them. They're staffed thin, but I couldn't do I could not do this effectively on my own without a few people there. I think the minimum people that we would need to do this effectively is probably probably Eleanor and I together could run an okay game in for 2.5 3 hours. That would be hard, but like we could probably do it with just two. But I tend to staff it with 4 to 5 people. Now that's not all people who are W2s for me. Often we'll bring in people who are consultants that just serve as role players or help us to build the information environment for a game. But I'll tend to staff a game with at least 4 to 5 people, and sometimes as much as 7. So here's what we started to do, and this is something I'm really proud of. We initially had them look a lot like war games that, for example, you'll see being run for the US government, right? So if you see a war game run for the US government, there's like this flurry of activity, a turn ends, then there's a pause. There might be 45 minutes, sometimes even over an hour of adjudication, then gameplay continues. We used to do that. I realized the way that we do things with like the reliance on large language models and the proprietary system that we've designed for game design, which helps to build in flexibility, we actually didn't have to do that. So about a year and a half ago, actually a little bit more than that, it might be about 2 years ago by now, we were running a game for a client. We only had 2 hours, and I said, "Look, there's no way that this game will work if with 2 hours. You cannot stop for adjudication." And so thinking it through, I realized we could go to what I called a zero turn game or continuous adjudication, not to be confused with the security clearance form of continuous adjudication. But it's where people will submit moves and you don't stop to adjudicate. Instead, there's a rolling news feed. People know when like the information environment's updated or they'll get new memos, and we have set times that it goes out, but we just do the adjudication as it rolls in, and we don't stop gameplay ever. Instead, people just immerse and they play, and it's adjudicated quietly, and the information environment updates, but it is a zero turn game. Now, what I found is that that better mimics what is done in the real world, number one. But number two, here was what was shocking for me. Like our games are very well rated, and so if you look at, we keep statistical data on all of our games. We rate them on a 4-point scale in terms of participant experience. For the same reason that Google does it that way. It's explained in a book called Work Rules by Google's former chief people officer, which is that it just forces you to make harder choices when it's a 4-point scale. So over 75% of our ratings are 4-point ratings. We've gotten, I think, in 5 years of games, a total of 6 1-point ratings out of over 600 surveys, and we get like a small smattering of 2-point ratings. Since we moved to zero turn gameplay, we have never gotten 2 points or below. It's always been 3s and 4s. The reason why is that generally when people are upset about one of our games, it's because their team performed poorly and they get mad at the adjudication. What I realized, and this was an unintended benefit, but it was a benefit, that once we moved to a zero turn format, the adjudication became so invisible that people don't stop to get mad at the adjudication. And that to me was really interesting. So anyway, that's the way that we do it. The game will be rolling, but it takes like a longer team. And in terms of some of the internals of how to be able to adjudicate that quickly, I'd be happy for you or anybody on this call to like walk them through the details of it. But the main point there is that moving to a zero turn game, that's the way I would do it. That makes it makes it work well. I'll give one final technical point, which is that when we move to like a 2.5 hour or 3 hour game, we'll obviously cut it down and simplify a bit, but we find that sometimes we have to simplify as the game is going. So like this last game we ran at Georgetown, it was a different game, but we ran it in early September. As we got to the middle of the game, like I just started hacking plot lines out because I realized there was too much there. And we wanted to make sure people were focusing in on the things we found interesting and relevant. So we started stripping things out that we had prepared that were like beautifully crafted, but that just weren't good to go forward with because it would make the universe too big.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. We often design like crumple zones into our game. Like, oh yeah, we know in advance. Like if things are running long, this is the first thing to go. I would love a little more clarity on the types of interventions and actions that the players are submitting, and also the like on the game state side. Is it more qualitative, or do you have like little models running on the back end?
So those are both great questions. For in terms of qualitative versus quantitative, no, they tend to always be qualitative. We have run games with more quantitative dimensions to them, but the way that we're doing things works best when it's qualitative. And I kind of would question the quantitative model unless it's really good. It's going to be hard to have a quantitative model to deal with what we're doing, other than something that is similar to the Rand Corporation's RFlex system. So the RFlex system basically has when teams make a move, you'll have subject matter experts determine probabilities, and a die will be rolled based on the subject matter expert's probability. That's a very rough quantitative model. It's not, it's not a model that would pass any like actual quants sniff test, but it does like A, incorporate randomness, and B, incorporate subject matter expertise. So we'll do something like the Rand RFlex system. The second thing in terms of the decisions they're making, that's a great question. I should have spoken about that. Generally in our games, there are four different ways people interact with the game world. One is through their interactions with role players. Those interactions always influence the game world, whether people realize it or not. The other ways that are more formal moves are number one, teams are given a limited number of open-ended moves in a game. In a 4-hour game, they might be given 2 open-ended moves. Secondly, they'll be given a number of negotiations. They might, in a 4-hour game, be able to do 3 negotiations with other player teams. So basically, they can take a move and take action through negotiations. Then the third thing, though, is that they're given decision points. Decision points are curated moves where we ask what they're going to do about a certain topic. So, for example, California might get a memo about climate change and its deepening effects and say, hey, what are you going to do about this? It'll usually present a few options, but they don't have to go with our options. They can always decide their own course of action because, again, it's meant to be open-ended moves. Now, the more time pressured it is, the more likely we are to limit or to get rid of open-ended moves entirely, and instead to just go with the decision points, which is the curated moves, meaning that they can, and so there's a number of games where we do that, where all they have are the decision points. And so it still is, a technical feat to be able to adjudicate all of that well, but it's bounded a little bit more when we don't have decisions on absolutely anything under the sun.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And it's interesting to situate it relative to like the Lux Capital Risk games and like Matrix games, and interesting seeing how it's different. And also, the sense I get is you have a bunch of sort of pre-planned branching paths of where things might go, and you just sort of is it that you sort of based on all the actions you say, okay, it feels like we're heading toward this scenario over here.
Yeah, and sometimes we just have to create a new scenario entirely. Right, we've had games where teams have done things like there's one game which we were running for the Canadian Defense and Security Network in Ottawa last year. It was a negotiation game, and so we had like a pre-planned ending to the game because like it was a game where the logic of the game was teams would negotiate. It wasn't a hard negotiation. They would like the teams would ultimately reach a conclusion, and there'd be this happy ending where everything wraps up well. But it fell apart. And so like we had to like scrap the entire ending that we'd put together and create an ending where everything falls apart and where the negotiation can't be reached, so awful things happen. So we spent a morning putting that together, and we'll often do that on the fly. This is where a little bit of storytelling comes into play, that oftentimes it's the facilitator who can do that. You might have a slide with a picture and like a headline or something like that, but oftentimes storytelling has to do the job. to allow you to adapt because you're not able to generate news articles and the like quickly enough.
Add something really quickly. A lot of the time, the players, the teams, they're not the president of the United States. If it's Team US, they're advisors to the president. So just in a recent game, we had Russia submitted a team, their advisors, to the Kremlin, advisors to Putin, and they said if they made a deal with the US, which was another team, and they said if US negs on the deal, we will nuke California. Putin will not nuke California if the U.S. does not approve sanctions relief. That is not logical. Maybe in like a different version of the game, but this is, the game, the priority of the game is to get students to learn here. And so what we ended up doing was we, demoted the team lead. We said she needed to spend more time with her family. And doing the little Russian kin, and we promoted someone else within the game, and we do this all in like good fun. David was there; he went in. The former team lead like cracked a joke. It was ended up being fine. And I think the quote was, even her name was Nicole. Even Nicole actions were even too extreme for President Putin, and that means something. So. There are parameters like left and right, so it's not going to just be a complete random something happening. I think, David, did you pull up the slide?
Yeah. The slide of Nicole Ma stepping down as head of credible leadership to spend more time with her family, and then there's another news article that Eleanor created, which provides the actual story of what occurred. Exclusive: was Nicole Ma fired after pushing to nuke California? And there's a whole. You can see the quote that Eleanor just referred to. The fact that Nicole Ma's decisions were too radical even for Vladimir Putin says a lot. Now, the reason why this worked is in part because Nicole is a really awesome human being, and like she thought that this was the funniest thing, right? Sometimes people will get a little bit like actually upset about things like that, and that is not the vibe that we wanted to create. But I know that I know we don't want to filibuster this. We don't want to cause it to run overtime because I know that we're at the hour. So Randy and all members of this community, I really wanted to thank you for the opportunity to interact with you. Randy, you're doing amazing work. We're looking forward to having the opportunity to get to talk further about opportunities for collaboration. And for everyone on this call, I know there's some really accomplished and interesting designers here. And we hope that this is the first step for Valens Games in a dialogue with all of you. So I really wanted to thank you for taking the time to spend this hour with us and talk about the immersive exercise style of game.
Awesome. Thank you so much for coming and chatting and sharing. You both were just awesome.